To continue in our King of Scars by Leigh Bardugo. We are now in chapter 7, Zoya. Zoya rose when the sky was still dark. She would see to the morning's business before she made the walk to the Grand Palace to unlock Nikolai. A week had passed since they arrived back at the capital, and to her relief, the king's monster had made no more appearances. Tamar and Nadia were already waiting in the common room outside her chambers, seated at a round table that had once belonged to the Darkling's personal guard. Nadia was still in her blue dressing gown, but Tamar was in uniform, arms bare, axes glinting at her hips. Reports of 2 more Kurgad attacks, said Tamar, holding up a sheaf of papers covered in tight scrawl. I need tea, said Zoya. How could the world be falling apart before sunrise? It wasn't civilized. She poured herself a glass from the samovar and took the documents from Tamar's hand. There were more spread across the table. Where did they strike this time? 3 Grisha taken from Sykersk and 8 more south of Karyeva. Zoya sat down hard. So many? The Shu had used their stores of Jurdapadan to develop a new kind of warrior. Soldiers tailored by Grisha fabricators, honed to greater strength, given wings, weighted fists, unbreakable bones, and heightened senses. They called them Kergud. Tell her the rest, said Nadia. Zoya's gaze locked on Tamar. There's more? This is Ravka, said Tamar. The Grisha near Sikursk were traveling undercover. Either the Shu knew about the mission, or Nina was correct and these new soldiers really can somehow sniff out Grisha, finished Nadia. Nina warned us, said Tamar. She did, didn't she? Said Zoya bitterly. How fortunate then that our good king sent our chief source of information on these Shu soldiers thousands of miles away. It was time, said Tamar. Nina was lost in her grief. It will do her good to be of use. What a consolation that will be when she's captured and executed, Zoya retorted. She pinched the bridge of her nose. The Shu are testing us, pushing farther into our territory. We have to push back. With what? Nadia asked. A stern warning? It would be one thing if we could target them at home, said Tamar. But my sources have had no luck discovering the locations where they're creating and training the Kurgud soldiers. Zoya's stomach knotted when she thought of those bases, of the Grisha volunteers the Shu had addicted to Param to create these monstrosities. She reached for another file. Are these the dissections? Tamar nodded. The body of 2 Kurgud soldiers had been retrieved from Ketterdam and brought back to the little palace for study. Dolly had objected, claiming it was wrong to desecrate a fallen soldier's body, but Zoya had no patience for fine feeling when their people were being stolen from within their very borders. This metal, Zoya said, pointing to the notes David had made in the margin of one of the detailed anatomical sketches created by the corporality, the one they're using to plate the bones. It's not just Grisha steel. It's an alloy, said Nadia. They're combining Grisha steel with ruthenium. It's less malleable, but more durable. I've never heard of it before. It's extremely rare. There are only a few known deposits around the world. Tamar leaned forward. But the Shu are getting it from somewhere. Zoya tapped her finger to the file. Find the source. Track the shipments. That's how we'll figure out where the Kurgud are being made. Tamar ran her thumbs over her axis. When we do, I'm leading the attack. Zoya nodded. I'll be right beside you. Nadia grinned, and I'll be watching your back. Zoya hoped it would be soon. She was itching for a fight. She glanced at the clock on the mantel. It was time to wake the king. A cold mist had crept over the grounds in the night, covering the trees and stone paths in a veil of cloud. She passed through the woods beneath a canopy of twisting branches. They would bloom white and pink and red as blood when spring came, but for now they were only grey wood and thorns. She emerged the manicured hedges and sprawling lawns that surrounded the Grand Palace, lanterns casting light over the still dark grounds in muzzy halos. The palace looked like a bride before her wedding, its white stone terraces and golden statues cloaked in mist. It should have been peaceful, this soft grey hour before dawn, but all she could think of was the Kurgud, the Zemanai, the Fiadans, the Kirch. Each day she worked with new recruits at the little palace and managed the affairs of the Second Army. It had grown under her command, slowly recovering from the wounds the Darkling had dealt them. Wounds that had almost been death blows. How could he do it? She still wondered. The Darkling had built up the strength of the Second Army over generations, adding to its numbers, improving its training, solidifying his own influence. He had cultivated the talents of young Grisha, helped them develop their skill. He had raised them like children, and when his children had misbehaved, when his coup attempt had failed and some of the Grisha had dared to stand with Alina Starkov against him, he murdered them, without hesitation or remorse. Zoya had watched them fall. She'd almost been among them. Almost, she reminded herself as she climbed the palace steps. But I survived to lead the army he built and nearly destroyed. Zoya had vowed to make the Second Army a power to be reckoned with again. She'd gone deeper within the borders of Yerda and the Shuhan, pierced the shores of the Wandering Isle and the frontiers of Novi Zem in search of Grisha, who might wish to learn to fight and who might give their allegiance to Ravka. She was determined to capitalize on that growth, to assemble a force greater than what even the Darkling had raised. But that wouldn't be enough. She intended to find a way to protect Grisha throughout the world so no one would ever have to live in fear or hide their gifts again. A governing body with representatives from every nation to hold their countries accountable. A guarantee of rights and of punishment for anyone who tried to imprison or harm her kind. For that dream to be anything more than a pleasant fantasy, Ravka would have to be strong, and so would its king. As Zoya strode through the grand palace halls to Nikolai's chambers, she cast a look at two servants lingering outside his door that sent them shrinking up against the wall like frightened anemones. She knew the way they sighed over their poor king. He's never been the same since the war, they whispered, swooning and dabbing their eyes whenever he was near. She couldn't blame them. Nikolai was rich, handsome, and beset by a tragic past, perfect daydream fodder. But with her luck, the king would ignore the suitable prospective brides she'd found, fall for a common housemaid, and insist on marrying for love. It was just the kind of contrary and romantic nonsense he was prone to. She greeted Talia, rang for a breakfast tray, then entered the king's bedroom and threw open the curtains. The morning light had turned pale and rosy. Nikolai cast her a baleful glare from his place among the pillows. "You're late, and you're chained to bed. Perhaps not the best time to be critical." "It's too early in the morning to threaten the king," he said grumpily. She sat down beside him and began the work of unshackling him. "I'm at my most murderous on an empty stomach." Zoya was grateful for the chatter. It was meaningless, but it filled the silence of the room. They'd slipped back into an easy routine after the near disaster in Yvette's, but she could never quite accustom herself to this intimacy. The dawn quiet, the rumpled sheets, the tousled hair that made Nikolai look less a king than a boy in need of kissing. "Entertain me with lively tales of her childhood," he'd said to her. Zoya doubted the king would be amused by her stories. "Should I tell you about the old man my mother wanted to marry me off to when I was 9 years old? Should I tell you what happened on my wedding day, what they tried to do to me, the damage I left in my wake?" Zoya finished the business of freeing him from his bonds, taking care to touch his warm skin as little as possible, then left the king to wash and dress. A moment later, a knock sounded on the sitting room door, and the servant entered with hot tea and a tray of covered dishes. Zoya didn't miss the furtive glance in her direction as he scurried away. Perhaps she should simply give in to the rumor that she was Nikolai's mistress and let people talk. At last, then she could skip the pre-dawn trek from the little palace and sleep in. Nikolai sauntered into the sitting room, golden hair combed neatly, boots shined, impeccably attired as always. "You look well rested," she said sourly. "I barely slept, and I woke with a crick in my back that feels like Toya played lawn tennis with my spine. But a king does not hunch, Zoya dear. Are you eating my herring?" She popped the last bite into her mouth. "No, I have eaten your herring." Now, before Zoya could begin to address the business of the day, the door flew open and Tamar entered, followed by her brother, golden eyes glinting, both of them fully armed. "Tell me," Nikolai said, all hint of his easy manner gone. "There's trouble with the pilgrims camped outside the city walls. The apparat doesn't like anything this new cult has to say. He's called the priest guard to the lower town." Zoya was on her feet in an instant. The apparat was meant to serve as spiritual counselor to the king, but he was a traitor and troublemaker through and through. Nikolai took a quick swig of his tea and rose. "Are our people in position?" Talia nodded. "We have heart-renders in plain dress interspersed throughout the crowd and snipers in position along the walls and the nearest hillside. There's not much to cover, though." "You knew this would happen?" Zoya asked Nikolai as she followed him and the twins back through the palace corridors. "I had a feeling." "And you made no move to stop him?" "How?" said Nikolai. "By barricading him in the chapel? I've heard worse ideas. He has no standing, but he has the means, and he knows I won't challenge him outright with armed troops." Zoya scowled. The priest guard should have been disbanded long ago. They were warrior monks, both scholar and soldier, and there was no question their loyalty lay with the apparat, not their king. Unfortunately, that would have caused riots among the common people, and I'm not keen on riots, unless they involve dancing, but I believe those are usually referred to as parties. What kind of party is this, Tamar? We've had our people circulating with the pilgrims every day and reporting back. They've been mostly peaceful, but this morning one of their preachers got them riled up. and the apparat must not have liked what he heard. The king's soldiers were waiting by the double eagle fountain with additional horses in tow. No uniformed soldiers will move past the lower wall without my say-so, Nikolai commanded. The Grisha are only there for crowd control unless I give the signal. Keep the snipers in position, but absolutely no one is to act without direct orders from me. Understood? The king had the right to command his forces as he saw fit, and Zoya trusted twins to make the best possible use of their heart-renders to protect the crown. But Zoya's temper still bristled at the fact that they'd been put in this position. Nikolai was too fond of compromise. The apparat had betrayed everyone who had ever been foolish enough to trust him. He was a snake, and if she'd had her way, he and his priest-guard lackeys would have been offered two choices after the Civil War: execution or exile. They mounted and were headed through the gates when Nikolai said, "I need you calm, Zoya. The apparat isn't fond of the Grisha triumvirate to begin with. I weep, and outright hostility from you won't help. I know you don't approve of allowing the priest to remain in the capital. Of course you should keep him here, preferably stuffed above my mantle. A stirring conversation piece, no doubt, but we can't afford to make him a martyr. He has too much sway among the people." Zoya ground her teeth. "He is a liar and a traitor. He was instrumental in deposing your father. He tried to keep Alina and me captive beneath the earth. He never lent his support during the war. All true. If I ever need to study for a history exam, I know who to come to." "Why wouldn't he listen? The priest is dangerous, Nikolai. He's more dangerous if we can see what he's doing. His network is far-reaching, and his sway with the people is something I can do nothing to combat directly." They passed through the gates and on the streets of the upper town. "We should have held a trial after the war," Zoya said. Made his crimes known. Do you really believe it would have mattered? Even if Alina Starkov herself rose from the fold and ensconced in sunlight to denounce him, the apparat would still find a way to survive. That's his gift. Now put on your most devout face, Zoya. You make a darling heretic, but I need you looking pious. Zoya ordered her features into a façon of calm, but the prospect of dealing with the apparat always left her caught between rage and frustration. Nikolai had rebuilt the royal chapel on the palace grounds after the war and had it consecrated by the apparat himself, a gesture of reconciliation. It was the site of Nikolai's coronation, where the lance of crown had been set upon his head and the moth eaten by supposedly sacred bearskin of Saint Grigory had been laid upon his shoulders. The painted triptych panels of the saints had been pulled from the rubble and refurbished. The gold of their halos burnished brightly. Ilya in chains, Lizabetha of the Roses. Aline had been added to their number with her white hair and antler collar, so that now 14 saints watched over the altar, assembled like a serene choir. Zoya had barely made it through the coronation. She couldn't help but think of the night the old chapel had fallen, when the Darkling had slaughtered most of the Second Army, the very Grisha he had spent his life claiming he would protect. If not for Tolya and Tamar, the war would have ended that night, and Zoya could admit that the apparat's forces had played their part too. Holy warriors known as the Soul That Saw, young men and women dedicated to worship of the Sun Saint, many of whom had been endowed with her power in the final battle with the Darkling and the Shadowfold. That little miracle had cemented Alina's legacy. It unfortunately bolstered the power of the apparat as well. It was hard not to suspect he had something to do with Bone Bridget events and the spate of strange happenings throughout Ravka. As they passed over the bridge and into the streets of the lower town, Zoya could hear the crowds outside the double walls, but it was only when they dismounted and reached the top of the battlements that she got a good look at the people gathered below. She heard her own gasp, felt shock travel her like a slap. These were not ordinary pilgrims who journeyed across the country to pay homage to the saints. They were not the Sun cult that had grown up around Alina Starkov and that often came to the palace walls to honor her. These people wore black. The banners they raised were emblazoned with the sun and eclipse, the Darkling symbol. They'd come here to praise the man who had torn Zoya's life apart. A young cleric stood on a rock. He had the long wild hair of the priest guard, but he wore black, not brown. He was tall and bony, and she doubted he could be much older than 20. "We begin in darkness," he cried to the swaying crowd, "and it is to darkness we return. Where else are the rich man and the poor man made equal? Where else is someone judged for nothing but the purity of his soul?" "What is this drivel?" Zoya demanded. Nikolai sighed. "This is the cult of the Starless Saint. They worship the Darkling." "And just how many followers do they have?" "We're not sure," said Damar. "There have been rumbling of a new cult, but nothing like this." The apparat had caught sight of the king and was making his way along the battlements. Zoya could see the priest guard arrayed behind him, wearing robes bearing Alina's golden sun and armed with repeating rifles. "Better and better," muttered Zoya. "Your Majesty," the apparat bowed deeply. "I am honored you would make time to lend me your support. I so rarely see you in the chapel. I sometimes fear you have forgotten how to pray. Not at all, said Nikolai, just not much for kneeling. Plays havoc at the joints, you brought armed men to the city walls, and you can see why. You've heard this blasphemy, this vile heresy? They want the church to recognize the Darkling as a saint. Who is this new cleric to you? Zoya said, striving to keep her tone even. Was he a member of the priest guard? He is the lowest form of traitor. You would know, she thought grimly. So that's a yes? He's a monk, confirmed Tamar. Yuri Vedinin. He left the priest guard a year ago. My sources don't know why. We can discuss the boy's provenance another time, said Nikolai. If you let the priest guard loose, you risk causing a bloodbath and making a whole slew of new martyrs, which will only validate their cause. You can't ask me to permit this heresy. Nikolai's voice was cold. I ask nothing. The apparat's already waxen face build further. Forgive me, your highness, but you must understand. This is not a matter for kings to decide. It is a battle for Ravka's every soul. Tell your men to stand down, priest. I will not have more blood shed in the capital. Nikolai did not wait for the apparat's reply, but descended on the battlements. Open the gates, he commanded. The king rides out. Are you sure this is wise? Murmured Tamar. I've heard the talk in this camp. These pilgrims aren't fond of you. Perhaps they just have gotten to know me yet. Stay close, Talia. You make sure those priest guards don't get any ideas. Try to keep them separated from my soldiers. I don't need to cause a riot of my own. I'm coming with you, said Zoya. Nikolai cast her a long look. I'm all for reckless choices, Zoya, but this is a delicate matter. You will have to bite your tongue. Until it bleeds. She wanted a closer look at the people gilding the Darkling's memory. She wanted to remember each of their faces. The gate rose and a hush descended as the king rode out of the city and into the crowd. The pilgrims might not care for Ravka's young ruler, but there were plenty of people who had come to the capital on other business. To trade or visit the lower town. To them, Nikolai Lantsov was not just a king or a war hero. He was a man who had restored order after the chaos of the civil war, who had granted them years of peace, who had promised them prosperity and worked to see it done. They went to their knees. Reb Ravka, they shouted, Korol Rezny, son of Ravka, king of scars. Nikolai raised his gloved hand in greeting, his face serene, his bearing erect, sliding from the role of commander to born nobility in the blink of an eye. Some of the black-clad pilgrims knelt with the rest of the crowd, but a few remained standing, gathered around their bony prophet, who stood defiant upon an outcropping of rock. Traitor! He shouted as Nikolai approached. Pretender! Thief! Murderer! But his voice trembled. I've certainly been busy, said Nikolai. They rode closer, forcing the pilgrims to move aside until the monk stood alone atop the rock to face Nikolai. Maybe younger than 20, Zoya thought. The monk's narrow chest rose and fell rapidly. His face was long, his skin pale except for 2 hectic spots of color on his cheeks that gave him the look of a boy with a fever. His eyes were a melancholy green at odds with the fervor in them. What is on his chin? Zoya whispered to Tamar. I believe he's trying to sprout a beard. She peered at his long face. He'd have better luck trying to grow a horn in the middle of his forehead. The monk flapped his black sleeves like a crow about to take flight. Tell your false priest to do what is right and recognize the starless one as a saint. I'll consider it, Nikolai said mildly. But first, I must ask you that you join me for breakfast. I will not be wooed. I will not be bribed. Yes, but will you have tea or coffee? A sitter rose from the crowd, the smallest release of tension. The boy raised his hands to the sky. The age of saints has come. The signs appear from the permafrost to the Sikorozioi. Do you think I will be swayed by your glib words and friendly demeanor? No, said Nikolai gently, and dismounted. Zoya and Tamar exchanged a glance. If this was all some elaborate setup for an assassination attempt, then the king was playing his part very well. May I join you? The young monk blinked, flustered. I suppose. Nikolai hoisted himself onto the rock. I don't expect you to be wooed or bribed or swayed by my admittedly winning demeanor, he said so quietly that only the monk and Zoya and Tamar could hear. But you may be swayed by the sniper stationed behind that gentle knoll. Do you see it? Excellent spot for picnicking, with orders to burst your head like a summer melon if I lift my right hand. Nikolai raised his hand, and the boy flinched, but the king merely adjusted the lapel of his coat. I would gladly be martyred, or you won't be martyred. Yuri, is it? You will be a mistake. That bullet will graze my shoulder and I'll make sure to fall very dramatically to the ground. The shooter will confess to being an assassin who wished to murder the Lantsov king. Maybe he'll even say he was loyal to the cause of the Starless Saint. But that's preposterous, the monk sputtered. Is it more preposterous to the king of Ravka putting himself in the path of a sniper's bullet in order to rid the kingdom of an upstart monk? Because that, my friend, is quite a story. Nikolai extended his hand. Come to breakfast. My cook makes a marvelous pork loin. I don't eat meat. Of course you don't, Zoya said. It's animals you object to killing, not people. The Darkling, spare me your sermons, she hissed. It is only my loyalty to the king that keeps me from pulling the air from your chest and crushing your lungs like hollow gourds. I've seen her do it, said Nikolai. Makes a funny sound. Kind of a pup, said Tamar. Wetter, Nikolai said. More of a squelch. I'll go, said the monk. But if I am not returned to my followers safe and unharmed, there will be blood in the streets. There will... Please let me do it, said Zoya. No one will miss him. Don't be silly, said Nikolai. I'm sure he has a mother, right? Yuri, nice woman, lives in Volchenko. Yuri touched his hand to his chest as if the king had struck him. Apparently Tamar's spies had gathered plenty of intelligence on this boy. I know, said Nikolai, patting the monk on his shoulder. Most disconcerting to realize you're gambling with the lives other than your own. Shall we? Yuri nodded, and Nikolai turned to the crowd. We will meet, he declared, voice booming. We will talk, he shrugged. Perhaps we will argue, but Ravkans need agree on nothing more than the drinking of tea. A ripper of laughter passed through the people, still kneeling but grateful now, relieved. Tamar gave the monk her horse, and they rode back through the gates. As soon as they were inside, the apparat rushed toward them, flanked by priest guards. We will take him into custody. I have many questions for this heretic. Yuri Vendinen is my guest, said Nikolai pleasantly. I insist that I be present at his interrogation. What a peculiar name for breakfast. You cannot possibly mean to Tolya, Nikolai said. Take our guest to the Irish suite and make sure he's adequately fed and watered. I'll join you shortly. They waited for the monk to be escorted away. It was clear the apparat was desperate to speak, but before he could open his mouth, Nikolai swung down from his horse. Priest, he said, and now his voice held the low, angry thrum of a temper barely leashed. Do not think that because I've let you live this long, I cannot change my mind. Accidents happen, even to men of faith. Forgive me, your highness, but a creature like this cannot be trusted. Pray go on, said Zoya. I'd like to see if an excuse of irony can actually kill a man. Why did the monk abandon the priest guard? Asked Nikolai. I don't know, admitted the apparat. He was a scholar, a good one. Better than that. His theories were unorthodox but brilliant. Then a year ago, he vanished without explanation, until Ricky appeared on our doorstep preaching this absurd gospel. Do you know where the cult originated? No, said the apparat. He sighed. But I think it was inevitable the people would seek to make the Darkling a saint. Why? Said Zoya. The common people had no love for him. In life, no. In death, a man may become anything at all. He possessed great power and died grandly. Sometimes that is enough. It shouldn't be, after everything he did. Very well, said Nikolai. We will grant the monk an audience and see what he has to say. The apparat's eyes protruded almost comically from his head. You cannot mean to speak with him. To lend his cause such credibility, it is the height of recklessness. Though Zoya might well have agreed with the priest, she still wanted to seize his filthy robes and shake him until he recognized he was talking to his king and not some supplicant. Not that she was particularly compliant when it came to Nikolai, but it was the principle of the thing. Nikolai remained unruffled, his temper forgotten. Calm yourself, priest. I have no intention of seeing the Darkling called saint. But if we can make a friend of this boy, we should, and I intend to get all of the information I can from him in the process. My followers will not like it, said the apparat, with false regret. I, of course, understand the need for diplomacy, but they may fear the spiritual corruption of their king. What a tragedy that would be. Perhaps there is a way to appease them and compensate you for this difficult day. The apparat bristled. The saints have no need of gold. Nikolai looked scandalized. Nothing so crass. Well, said the apparat, making a great show of thinking. Ulyask and Reavost are in need of new churches. The people need to know the king shares their faith, and such a gesture will help strengthen their faith in their ruler. After a long moment, Nikolai bobbed his chin. You will have your churches. They are the saints' churches, your highness. Then please inform the saints. Does the king bow so easily to a man with no title? Zoya asked as they rode away. She had said she would bite her tongue, and she had, but it had left her temper boiling. You are helping the apparat build his network of spies. You are making him stronger. At some point, you might consider treating me as something other than a fool. Trust me, Zoya. You may come to enjoy it. That's what Tamar said about absinthe, and it still tastes like sugar dipped in kerosene. Zoya cast a glance over her shoulder and saw the priest watching them from the city gates. His eyes, as dark as pit, Nikolai might joke all he liked, but every concession they made to the apparat felt like a misstep. The old king, the dark Alina Starkov, they'd all bargained with the priest, and all of them had paid in blood. Zoya spent the rest of her day overseeing a new squadron of squalors and sending orders to the outposts along the southern border. She hoped the Grisha forces there would be able to guard against a possible Shu attack. She dined in the hall of the Golden Dome beside Ganya and David, listening with one ear to Ganya's plans for the arrival of their international guests as she thumbed through a summary of David's work with Kuwei Yulbo. The young Inferni sat at the table surrounded by other young Grisha. His late father had created Parem, and Kuwei had done his best to share his knowledge of that work with David and the other fabricators attempting to alter the addictive side effects of the drug, but he was less a scientist than a soldier. Though Genya had tailored him slightly, Kuwei's gifts as an Inferni were his greatest disguise. No one in the Shuhan had known of his abilities. He had chosen a new name when he'd come to the little palace, Naban. It meant rising phoenix in Shu. The boy was as pretentious as he was gifted. After dinner, she managed another hour of work before she ventured to the Grand Palace to lock Nikolai in for the night and allowed herself to retire to her chambers. They had once belonged to the Darkling. Genya and David had refused them what they'd assumed their duties in the triumvirate, but Zoya had gladly occupied the spacious room, so she was happy to take anything that had once been his, and she had swung the first hammer when it was time to tear down the old furnishing and remake the space to her liking. A gesture. She wasn't about to let her hands get callous and had left the real effort to the workmen. It had taken long months and considerable fabricator craft to fashion the rooms to her taste, but now the domed ceiling showed a sky thick and with cloud, and the walls had been treated to look like a storm-swept sea. Few people noticed the little boat that had been painted into one of the 6 corners, or the flag it flew with 2 tiny stars, and no one who did would have known what it meant. Zoya washed and dressed for bed. There had been a time when she had been able to sleep deeply beneath the dome of the little palace, but that was before the Darkling's coup. He had shattered her belief that nothing could touch this palace, this home that had once been a haven. Now she slept lightly and woke instantly at the sound of a knock on her chamber door. The monk, she thought. I knew we shouldn't have let him into the palace. But as soon as Zoya slid the bolt and opened the door, Tamar said, "Nikolai is out." "Impossible," Zoya protested. Though she was already reaching for her boots, Tamar's brow rose as Zoya tossed a coat over her nightdress. Cobwebs of silver silk that flickered like lightning in a storm cloud with the lamplight struck the sheer fabric just right. "Who did you dress for tonight?" she asked. "Myself," snapped Zoya. "Do we know where he headed?" Talia saw him fly westward by the Kiriv. "Anyone else?" "I don't think so. No alarm sounded, but we can't be sure. We're lucky this didn't happen in the summer." But the sun never properly set and anyone would be able to see a monster in disguise. "How?" Zoya asked as she nudged a panel in the wall and slid open to reveal a long flight of stairs. When she'd had her chambers refurbished, she had a tunnel dug to connect to the network of passage beneath Os Alta. "Those chains are reinforced with Grisha steel. If he's gotten stronger—" "They weren't broken," said Tamar from behind her. "They were unlocked." Zoya stumbled and nearly toppled down the stairs. Unlocked? Then someone knew Nikolai's secret, had sought to sabotage her work to keep it undiscovered? The implications were overwhelming. Long moments later, they were pushing into the basement of convent of Sancta Elisabetta. Tolia waited in the gardens with 3 horses. "Tell me," Zoya said as she and Tamar mounted. "I heard glass breaking," Tolia replied. When I ran inside, I saw the king take flight from the window casement. No one had come or gone through his door." "Dang it. Then had the monster somehow managed to pick the locks?" Zoya kicked her horse into a gallop. She had 1,000 questions, but they could worry about how Nikolai had gotten free once they retrieved him. They rode hard over the bridge and through the streets of the lower town. At a signal to the guards, they thundered through the gates and Os Alta's famous double walls. How far had Nikolai gotten? How far would he go? Better that he flew away from the city, away from anywhere heavily populated. Zoya reached for the invisible currents that flowed around them, higher and higher, seeking the disruption and the wind that was Nikolai. It was not only the weight and size of him, but the very wrongness of him that brushed against her power, Mirzos, abomination, the taint of something monstrous in his blood. "He still head west," she said, feeling his presence bleed across her senses. "He's in Balakiriv, a pretty little spot, one of the favorite places for Grisha to visit for sleigh rides and festival in better times." They slowed their horses as they approached the outskirts of the town, and the dry roads gave way to cobblestones. Balakiriv slept, its windows dark and house quiet. Here or there Zoya saw a lantern lit through the glass, a mother tending to a fuzzy infant, a clerk working late into the pre-dawn hours. She turned her awareness to the skies and gestured the twins forward. Nikolai was moving toward the center. The main square was silent, lined by the courthouse, the town hall, the grand offices of the local governor. Stone paths radiated from a large oak fountain, where Zoya knew the women would come to do their washing. A statue of Sanctuary stood at its center, his lance piercing the heart of a great dragon as water cascaded from the back of the beast's wings. So I had always hated that particular story. The great warrior jury seemed like a big bully. The roof, she whispered, pointing to the town hall. I'll watch the perimeter. Tamar and Toya slipped silently from their horses, shackles in hand and disappearing into the building. If Nikolai took flight, she could try to bring him down or at least track him, but dawn was coming on. They had to move quickly. She waited in the shadows, eyes trained on the spars of the town hall. The night felt too still. Zoya had an uncomfortable sense that she was being watched, but the shops and buildings surrounding the square showed no signs of life. High above, the roofline of the town hall seemed to shift. A shadow broke from the roof, wings spread against the moonlit sky. Zoya lifted her hands and prepared to bring Nikolai down, but he circled once, then settled on the towering spike of the church's bell tower. Dang it! Zoya and Tamara would be racing up the stairs of the town hall, only to find their quarry escaped. If Zoya attempted the church stairs, Nikolai could well make another leap and be long gone before he reached the top. The sky was already turning gray, and if he broke for open countryside, they might never catch him. There was no time to hesitate. She eyed the open notches in the stonework of the bell tower. Even with her amplifier, she'd never managed the control necessary for flight. Only Grisha flush with the effects of Jur the Pattern could accomplish that feat. This is going to hurt. She muttered and spun her hands in tight circles, summoning the current and arced her arms. The gust hit her from behind, lofting her upward. It took all her will to resist the urge to pinwheel her arms and let the wind take her higher. She thrust her hand forward and the gust threw her toward the gap in the stone. Too hard, too fast. There was no time to adjust her aim. Zoya covered her head and face, then grunted as her shoulder cracked against the edge of a column. Oof. She tumbled to the floor of the bell tower in a graceless heap and rolled to her back, trying to get her bearings. There, high above, perched in the eaves, she caught the glint of the monster's eyes in the dark. She could just make out of shape. His chest was bare, his torn trousers slung low on his hips, his taloned feet curved over the beams of the bell tower. A low growl reached her, seemed to reverberate through the floorboards. Something was different tonight. He was different. Oh, saints, she realized. He's hungry. In the past, Zoya had been slower to find Nikolai, locating him after he had hunted and fed. He's never killed a human before, she reminded herself, than a man did, that we know of. But she felt in her bones that tonight she was the prey. Like hell. She pushed her feet and hissed in a breath at the throb in her shoulder. She dislocated it, maybe broken the bone. Pain rolled through her in a wave that set her stomach churning. Her right arm was useless. She'd have only her left arm to summon with, but if Adri could do it, so could she. Nikolai, she said sternly. The growl stopped and picked up again, lower and louder than before. A tendril of fear uncurled in her belly. Was this what it was to be a small creature pinned helpless in the wood? Nikolai, she snapped, not letting her terror enter her voice. She thought it might be a very bad thing if he knew she was afraid. Get down here. The growl rippled and huffed, almost like a laugh. Before she could make sense of that, he launched himself at her. Zoya threw up her hand and a blast of wind pummeled the creature, but her attempt had only half the strength of her usual summoning. It drove him backward, and he struck the wall but with little force. She saw the monster register her injury, her weakness. It drew in a long breath, muscles tensing. How many nights had she kept it from its fun? How long had it been waiting for a chance to hurt her? She needed help. Zoya! She shouted. Tamar! But could they even hear her at such distance? Zoya eyed the bell. The monster lunged. She dove right and screamed as her injured shoulder hit the slats, but threw her other arm up with all the force she could muster, begging the storm to answer. Wind seized the bell and sent its massive metal shell swinging. The clapper struck a reverberant clang that shuddered through her skull and made the monster snarl. The bell struck a second time, far more weakly, before it slowed its arc. Zoya was sweating now, the pain turning her vision black at the edges. She dragged herself toward the wall. Nikolai. The monster was sprawling toward her in a low crouch, its clawed feet silent over the slats of the floor, the movement eerily inhuman. It was Nikolai, and yet it was not Nikolai. The elegant lines of its face were the same, but its eyes were black as ink. The shadows of its wings seemed to pulse and seethe. Nikolai, she said again, I'm going to be furious if you try to eat me, and you know what? I'm like when I'm mad. Its lips drew back and smiled. There was no other word for it, revealing needle-sharp fangs that gleamed like shards of obsidian. Whatever was stalking her was not her king. Captain, she tried. Sturmhond. Nothing. It stalked closer. Sobachka, she said. Puppy, the nickname he'd had as a child, one she'd never used with him before. Stop this. From somewhere far below she heard the door slam. Toya? Tamar? It didn't matter. They weren't going to make it in time. Zoya could summon lightning, but without both arms to control the current, she knew she would kill him. She raised her arm again. The gust drove the creature back, but its claws scraped the wooden floor and it plowed forward, wings pinned tight to its body, dark gaze focused on her. It batted her good arm aside, hard enough that she thought it might have broken that bone too. The wind fell away and that monster's wing flared wide. It opened its mouth and spoke. Zoya. She flinched. The monster did not speak. It could not. But it wasn't even the shock of speech coming from the creature's lip that so frightened her. That was not Nikolai's voice. It was soft, cool as glass, familiar. No, it couldn't be. Fear was clouding her mind. The creature's lips parted. Its teeth gleamed. It seized her hair and yanked her head back as she struggled. It was going to tear her throat out. Its lips brushed the skin of her neck. 1,000 thoughts crowded into her mind. She should have brought a weapon. She shouldn't have relied on her power. She shouldn't have believed she wasn't afraid to die. She shouldn't have believed that Nikolai would not harm her. The door to the bell tower slammed open and Tamar was there, Talia behind her. Tamar's axes flew, one lodged in the creature's shoulder, the other in the meat of one of its wings. The thing turned on them, snarling, and Talia's hands shot out. Zoya watched, torn between lingering dread and fascination as the creature's legs buckled. It growled, then fell silent as Talia slowed its heart and sent the monster into unconsciousness. Zoya rose, cradling her dislocated arm, and looked down at the thing on the floorboards as its claws receded, the dark veins retracting and fading, its wings dissolving to shreds of shadow. The king of Ravka lay on the bell tower floor, golden hair disheveled, boyish and bleeding. Are you all right? Asked Tamar. Yes, Zoya lied. Zoya. The sound of his voice in that moment, smooth as glass, neither human nor inhuman. Did that mean that whatever was inside him was not the mindless monster it assumed? It hadn't just been hungry. There had been something vengeful in its desire. Would Nikolai have woken with her blood on his lips? You know what this means, said Tamar. They couldn't control him. The palace was no longer safe, and Nikolai was no longer safe in it. And right now, ambassadors, dignitaries, noblemen, and wealthy merchants were packing their best clothes and preparing to travel to Asalta, to say nothing of the eligible princesses and hopeful noblemen, women who accompanied them. We have invited emissaries from every country to witness this horror, said Talia, to watch Nikolai descend into bloodlust, to play audience as a king became more monster than man. Zoya had given her life to the Second Army, to dream that they could build something better. She had believed that if her country was strong enough, the world might change for her kind. Now that dream was collapsing. Zoya thought of the stories Nina had told them of the prison of the Ice Court. She thought of the Kurgud emerging from the skies to steal Grisha from the safety of their lands. She remembered bodies littering the grounds of the little palace, the night of the darkling stag. She would not let it happen again, she refused. Zoya took a deep breath and slammed her shoulder back into place, ignoring the jolt of nausea that came with the pain. We find a cure, she said, or Ravka falls.
Chapter 8. Nina. I don't like leaving Leonie behind, said Adric, his solemn voice like the tolling of a particularly forlorn bell. They're hardly friendly at the convent, and she doesn't speak the language. Nina and Adric had made their way out of the valley, the sledge pulled behind their two mounts, a hard wind at their backs. Nina rode side saddle, her heavy skirts gathered behind her. She wasn't much of a rider to begin with, and this concession to Fjerdan's sensibilities was one of the most challenging elements of her cover. As they traveled farther from the town, the whispers rose in her head as if in protest. Now that she knew the dead had brought her to Gaffal, the sound seemed to have grown clearer, the high, sweet voices of the lost tugging at her thoughts. She hadn't told Adric and Leonie about the graves at the factory yet. The incident by the eastern gate had left her too shaken. Lena will be fine, said Nina, turning her attention to Adric. She's resourceful and she knows how to lie low. Besides, we'll be back by midday tomorrow. Adric said nothing, and Nina added, "Cossetting her isn't going to win you any points." The chill had made Adric's skin rosy beneath his freckles, and he looked a bit like a sulky actor whose cheeks had been rouged for play. She's a soldier under my command. I would never cross that line. She won't be under your command when this mission is over, Adric, and it's obvious she likes you. She does? He sounded disconsolate over the news. Nina wasn't fooled. She adjusted the straps of her pack, to my great astonishment. You like me too, Zanik. Must be my sunny outlook. Adric, if the choice is between taking orders from you or Zoya Nazyalensky, you're always going to win. His breath plumped into cold air. I used to be completely in love with her. Weren't we all? Even when she's slicing you in two with a few well-chosen words, it's hard to focus on anything but how good she looks doing it. Appalling, Adric mused. I once saw a student set fire to his own hair because he was so busy looking at Zoya. She didn't even spare him a second glance. Nina fixed Adric with a contemptuous stare, and her most disdainful Zoya voice drawled. Someone throw a bucket on that idiot before he burns down the palace. He shuddered. That was far too convincing. He consulted his map as they reached a crossroads. Zoya was nice enough to look at, he said as he led them farther west, but there was more to it. She was the only one who treated me the same after I lost my arm. Horribly? She couldn't have shown me more contempt. Her insults were a lot easier to bear than Nadia constantly fussing over me. That's what sisters do, I assume. You were just as much of a mother hen when we all came back from the fold. They'd both been children, really. Nina had been a student at the Grisha school when they were all evacuated to the orphanage at Karam's Inn, but Adric had begged to go with his sister, to fight beside the Sun Summoner. He hadn't been there when the Darkling took Nina and the other students hostage. I wasn't worried about you, said Adric. If you'd all died and I'd been the only one to leave school, can you imagine how tiring it would have been to live with that guilt? Nina made herself laugh, but she knew all about guilt. She often wondered why she survived so much, captured by the Driscoll shipwreck, Kazbrecker mad hastes, and the ordeal of Param. She was the only known Grisha to have lived through a dose of the drug. What had made that possible? Was it that particular strain of Jurdaparam? Was it her desire to spite Jarl Broom and his witch hunters by surviving? Chance, fortune, fate. She didn't know what name to give it to it. Sometimes it felt like Matthias had kept her in this world through the sheer force of his will. I failed you, Matthias. I wasn't strong enough to save you. Little red bird, every day you choose the work of living. Every day you choose to go on. There is no failure here, Nina. Zoya's a better leader than I expected, admitted Edric, even if I'd never tell her so. Can you imagine? You might as well ask her if she wants to snuggle. General Zoya Nazyalensky does not need or want our approval. They fell into silence as the sun rose higher in the sky, the sledge rumbling over the ground. If it snowed, they would have to change the runners, but hopefully they would be back at Gaffel before the weather turned. It was a meager funeral procession, and Nina couldn't help but think Matthias deserved more. Something full of pomp and ceremony. A funeral fit for a hero, even if his people believed he was a traitor. I have been made to protect you. Even in death, I will find a way. His voice was too clear now, too strong, because this was their final parting. Because once Matthias was in the ground, he would belong to Jel. She wasn't sure she could do it. She couldn't bear the thought of abandoning his body to the cold earth, to the dark. Let me go to my God. She wished Inaj were here beside her, that the wraith were somewhere in all this silence. Nina longed for her stillness, her kindness. She was grateful to Adric, but he hadn't known Matthias, and he didn't really know Nina either. Not anymore. When at last they reached the fork of the river, they set up camp. A simple canvas tent lined with animal skins to keep the cold out. They made a fire, watered their horses, and sat down to a plain meal of tea and salt cod that Nina had to force herself to swallow. If anyone passed by, Adric and Nina planned to say they were on their way to Miles to show off their wares. The sledge was stocked with plenty of rifle loaders, but Nina doubted they'd have to offer any explanation. Like so much of Fierda, this place was desolate and empty. The little towns like flowers, unlikely blooms in the snow. Adric took a flask from his pocket, poured a small amount of black fluid into a copper cup, and contemplated it skeptically. What is that exactly? I just know it's distilled from pine tar. One of the fishermen said it was good for fighting the cold. He took a sip and instantly begged, coughing and pounding his chest. Saints, that's disgusting. Maybe they just mean it kills you, so you don't have to worry about the cold anymore. Or maybe they like selling overpriced misery to tourists. He offered her the flask, which Nina was quick to decline. For a while, they sat staring at the waters of the river rushing past. At last he said, "You never told me how he died." Nina wasn't certain what to say, or if she wanted to say it, anything at all. The specifics of the Ketterdam auction were unknown to most in Revka, even among the Grisha. Nina doubted Adric would be thrilled to discover she'd be running with a gang of criminals. "I don't really know. We were working together in Ketterdam. The worst of the mission was over. We thought we were all safe, but then Matthew showed up, bleeding. He had been shot. He'd found his way to her despite the fatal wound, despite the pain he was in, for one last kiss, for a final goodbye. There were Driscoll in the city, and they certainly had their reasons for wanting Matthews dead, but we all had prices on our heads. People were hungry for our blood, and the streets were a holy mess." She could still see his blood staining his shirt, feel the soft stubble of his nape beneath her fingertips. His hair had just begun to grow out properly, thick and golden. "He wouldn't tell me who was responsible," she said. Matthews hadn't wanted to burden her with that. He'd known she would strike out in her grief, but he should have understood that the mystery of his death would punish her. She thought her new mission working with the Ringsa in Ferda, getting Grisha to freedom, would help ease her grief and her guilt, but she felt no better than she had at the start of it all. "It eats me. I know that feeling." Adric took another sip from his flask and winced at the taste. "Vengeance was all that drove me at the end of the war. I wanted the Darkling to pay for my arm, for the lives of my friends. I wanted him dead. And you got your wish. And yet my arms didn't grow back. None of my friends came back to life." "I could help with that," Nina said, and was relieved when Adric laughed his dry, reluctant chuckle. Some Grisha blanched at any mention of her new power. She'd been a heartrender once, felt the pulse of the world beating along with her heart. Tarim had changed her. Nina had felt like a fraud sitting beneath the golden dome in the little palace, wearing her red kefta. She could no longer manipulate the living, hear the flow of their blood or the song of their cells. But the dead did her bidding, and she supposed she did their bidding too. She'd come to Gaffel after all. Nina finished the last of her tea. She could sense Adric waiting. She knew it was time. Maybe laying Matthews to rest would be the thing to help free her heart from this burden. She only knew she could not go in this way. She rose. "I'm ready," she said, though she knew it wasn't true. They rode up from camp, following the river. "Tell me a story, Mathias." She needed to hear him now, needed to know some part of him would remain with her. "Tell me about your family." "Tell me about yours, Nina. Why did you never speak of them?" "Because she'd never known them." She grew up in the foundling home, not unlike the orphanage at Karamzim. There were no records of Nina's parents. She was one more child who had arrived without papers or history. Kalechka, as Kay called it, from the fruit crate. She'd been given the name of one of the home's patrons and had worn donated clothes that arrived tied up in big sacks and smelling of the chemicals they were boiled in to make sure they were free of lice. "Were you unhappy, Nina?" "No, Mathias. It wasn't in your nature even then. It is now," she thought. Whatever spark had burned in her was no match for this grief. But back then, she hadn't been unhappy. Despite the chores and the boring lessons and the meals that were mostly cabbage, there had always been noise and company and games to play. She had appointed herself the home's official greeter, welcoming new arrivals, helping to name the new babies, and offering up her rag doll, Fyodora, to anyone who might need a friend on their first night in the dormitories. Besides, the staff always treated her kindly. "Come, little Nina, tell us the news," Baba Inessa would say, and seat Nina on a stool in the kitchen, where she could suck on a bread crust and watch the women at their work. Nina had been just 7 years old when she met her first tyrant. His name was Tomek, and he changed everything at the founding home. He wasn't the tallest or the strongest. He was simply the meanest, willing to strike and bite even the little orphans. If someone had a toy, he would break it. When a child was sleeping soundly, he would pinch them awake. He was all manners and dimples when the staff were near, but as soon as they were gone, cruel Tomek would return. As if they'd just been waiting for a leader. A group of bullies coalesced around him, boys and girls who had always seemed nice enough until they developed a taste for other steers. Nina did her best to avoid them, but it was as if Tomek could smell her happiness like smoke from a kitchen fire. One morning, just after the feast of St. Nikolai, Baba Inessa gave Nina an orange to share with the other children. Nina warned them to be silent, but they'd giggle and whooped until, of course, Tomek had marched over to investigate and snatched it from her hands. "Give it back!" she shouted, as he dug his thumbs into the orange waxy skin. It's for everyone. But Tomek and his friends had just cheered. You're fat enough already, he said, and pushed her so hard she'd fallen on her backside. Tomek had shoved the whole orange into his mouth and bitten down, laughing as pulp and juice dribbled over his chin. He laughed even harder when, to Nina's great shame, she started crying. Look how red you are, Tomek said, his mouth still full. You look like a rotten apple. He and his friends crowded around Nina, poking her belly, her arms, her legs. Look how rotten she is! Nina had been scared, but more than anything, she'd been angry. Curled up on the floor, she felt something in her shift, a long, luxurious stretch, like a cat yearning toward the sunbeam. All her breathlessness and fear rushed out of her, and it was as if she could feel Tomek's lungs as they expanded, contracted. She squeezed her fists tight. Look how Tomek hiccuped. Then his friends hiccuped. It was funny at first. They stopped poking Nina. They looked at one another and giggled, the sound broken by startled little huffs. They kept hiccuping. It hurt, said one, rubbing his chest. I can't stop, said another, bending double. It went on that way, all of them hiccuping and moaning long into the night, like an assembly of discontented frogs. Nina found she could do all kinds of things. She could soothe the crying infant. She could ease her own tummy ache. She could make Tomek's nose run and run and run until his whole shirt was wet with snot. Sometimes she had to stop herself from doing anything too terrible. She didn't want to be a tyrant too. Only a few months later, the Grisha examiners had come to the foundling home and Nina had been taken to the little palace. Goodbye, she called as she'd run through the hall saying her farewells. Goodbye! Write me lots of letters, please, and be nice, she'd warned Tomek. She's a merry child, Baba Inessa told the Grisha woman in her red kafta, trying not to break her of it. No one has, Nina. No one would ever will. I'm not so sure, Matthias. War hadn't done it. Captivity, torture. But loss was something different, because she saw no end to it. Only the far horizon stretching on and on. Nina knew the spot as soon as she saw it. A copse of trees by the riverbank, a place where travelers might come to rest and where the water eddied as if the river were resting too. Here, she told herself as she dismounted and untied a shovel and picked from the sledge. Here. It took her hours to dig. Adric couldn't help with the task, but he used his powers to keep the wind from tearing at her clothes and to shelter the lantern when the sky began to dim. Nina wasn't certain how deep to dig, but she went on until she was sweating in her coat, until her hands blistered, and then until the blisters broke. When she stopped panting, Adric did not wait for her signal, but began to untie the tarp on the sledge. Nina made herself help him, forced herself to move aside the boxes and gear that hid her true cargo. Here. Matthias was wrapped in linen, specially treated by the fabricators at the little palace to preserve him from decay, and reinforced by Leonie's craft. Nina thought of pulling the linen aside, of glimpsing his cherished face one more time, but she couldn't bear the idea of seeing his features still and cold, his skin gray. It was bad enough that she had the memory of his blood in her hands forever, the wound beneath her palms, his heart going still. Death was supposed to be her friend and ally, but death had taken him just the same. She could at least try to remember him as he'd been. Awkwardly, Nina and Adric rolled his body from the edge of the cart. It was huge and heavy. He tumbled into the tomb with a horrible thud. Nina covered her face with her hands. She had never been more grateful for Adric's silence. Lying in the well of the grave, Matthias' body looked like a chrysalis, as if he were at the beginning of something, instead of the end. He and Nina had never exchanged gifts or rings. They had no possessions they shared. They had been wanderers and soldiers. Even so, she could not leave him without nothing. From her pocket, she drew a slender sprig of ash and let it drift down into the grave, followed by a smattering of withered red petals from the tulips their compatriots had placed on his chest when they bid him goodbye in Ketterdam. I know you never cared for sweets. Her voice wobbled as she let a handful of toffees fall from her hand. They made a hollow patter. But this way I'm with you, and you can keep them from me. When I see you next, I know you won't eat them yourself. She knew what came now. A handful of earth, another. I love you, she told him, trying not to think of the graceless sound of the soil like the rattle of shrapnel, like sudden bursts of rain. I loved you. Her eyes blurred from the tears. She couldn't see him any longer. The earth rose higher. There would be snow soon, maybe even tonight. It would cover her work, a burial shroud, white and unmarred, and when spring came, The snow would melt and find its way through the soul and carry Matthew's spirit to the river, to Gel. He would be with his god at last. Will you take the sledge back to camp? And she asked Adric. There were still things she needed to say, but only to Matthias. Adric nodded and glanced up at the darkening sky. Just don't be too long. A storm's coming. Good, she thought. Let the snow come soon. I'd cover our work here. Nina knelt on the cold ground, listening to the hoofbeats of Adric's horse fade. She could hear the rush of the river, feel the damp of the earth through the heavy wool of her skirts. The water hears and understands. The ice does not forgive, fiated in words, the words of Gel. Matthias, she whispered, then cleared her throat and tried again. Matthias, she said more loudly. She wanted him to hear her, needed to believe he could. Oh, saints, I don't want to leave you here. I don't want to leave you ever. But that was not the hero's eulogy he deserved. She could do this for him. Nina drew a long, shaky breath. Matthias Helvar was a soldier and a hero. He saved me from drowning. He kept us both alive on the ice. He endured a year in the worst prison in the world for a crime he didn't commit. He forgave me for betraying him. He fought beside me, and when he could have abandoned me, he turned his back on the only country he'd ever known instead. For that, he was branded a traitor. But he wasn't. He believed his country could be more than it had been. He lived with honor and died with it too. Her voice broke and she forced a waver away from it. She wanted to be dignified in this moment. She wanted to give him that. He wasn't always a good man, but he had a good heart. A great, strong heart that should have kept beating for years and years. Little red bird, let me go. She wiped the tears from her eyes. This was the first half of her debt paid. She brought him home to the land he loved. There should be something to mark this moment. A bell to toll, a choir to sing for him, something so she knew it was time to say her last goodbye. But you're not done yet, my love. You and your sense of duty, she said in a bitter laugh. The whispers rose inside her head. She didn't want to hear them now, not here. Listen, Nina. She did not want to, but she knew she could hide from them no longer. The voices of the dead calling to her down the mountain, through the town, over the ice. The voices of women, of girls, anguish in their hearts. Something had happened to them on that hilltop. Help us, they cried. Hear us at last. The words were clear now, and they were drowning out Matthias' voice. Stop, she told them. Leave us alone. Leave me be. But the dead did not relent. Justice, they demanded. Justice. This was no hallucination. It wasn't madness either. The chorus was real, and they had brought her here for a reason. Nina had hoped her mission with Adric and Leonie would be enough to start healing. It hadn't been, but the girls on the mountain would not be denied. Justice. They had brought her this far, and they needed her to listen to them, not the echo of a love she could not hold on to. Nina placed a hand to her heart, and as the ache inside her broke, the ice giving way. There was only dark water beneath, the terrible pain of knowing he was truly gone, the awful understanding that she would never hear his voice again. But because the chorus was real. But Matthias' voice was not. It never had been. You were never here, she whispered, the tears coming hard now. You were never here. All this time she had wanted to believe that he was still with her, but it had been her voice all along, talking herself through the silence, forcing herself to do the work of living when all she wanted was to let go. Goodbye, Matthias. No one answered. She was alone in the silence. Chapter 9. Nikolai. We can call them back, said Genya, pacing before the fire. It's not too late. We send messengers and just tell the girls and their families there's been a change in plans. They'd gathered in the war room this morning, and Nikolai had called for coffee instead of tea. He developed a taste for it during his university days in Ketterdam, though between his exhaustion and the headache that had plagued him since the incident in Balakirev the previous night, he wouldn't have minded something stronger in his cup. The incident, with a generous turn of phrase. Talia had filled him in on every grim detail of his little display in the bell tower. He'd almost murdered one of his most valued generals, one of his only true friends, the person who had helped him to steer this cursed ship of a country for 2 years, who had kept his secrets and whom he had trusted to do so without question. He had almost killed Zoya. We'll tell them the king is unwell, continued Genya. That is the last thing we tell them, said Damar. Then we tell them there's been an outbreak of cholera or a massive sewage leak, said Toya. Tamar threw up her hands. So our choices are looking indecisive, weak, or like the capital is swimming in excrement? Zoya had been silent through the meeting thus far, hovering by the samovar with crossed arms. Keeping her distance, he knew he needed to apologize to her. But for once in his ridiculous life, he was completely at a loss for words. And before he could wrestle with that particular failure, there was the problem of the party had so cleverly planned, the one the demon within him seemed intent on crashing. Nikolai took another sip of bitter coffee, hoping it would clear his head. I think we may have a resource we didn't have before. As if she could read his thoughts, Zoya's gaze snapped to his. If you say that hideous flagpole of a monk, I will marvel at my ingenuity, plant a fond kiss upon my cheek, put up a plaque to my genius. I will put a plaque at the palace while commemorating this date as the morning on which Nikolai Lantsov took leave of his senses. The boy is a lunatic, a zealot, who worships at the feet of the man who started the civil war and murdered half of the Second Army. He worships an ideal. It's something we've all been guilty of at one time or another. Zoya turned away, but not before he saw the hurt on her face. Zoya Nazyalensky did not flinch, but the pain had been unmistakable. Nikolai wanted to stop the meeting, and he didn't know what exactly, but he did know that the correct response to almost killing someone who was not to try to score points off them the next day. Then by all means, said Zoya, let's welcome a former member of the priest guard to the war room and put her future in his grubby hands. Isn't she lovely when she agrees? Nikolai asked, and savored Zoya's scowl. It was so much better than seeing that stark, wounded look and knowing he had caused it. But a moment later, he was kicking himself as Toya escorted the monk into the war room, and Zoya's grim expression turned to bemusement. Your Highness, said Yuri stiffly. He was so tall he had to duck entering the room, and so slender he looked as if he might turn sideways and get carried away by a draught. I was warned of your glib tongue. You talk of breaking bread, but I spent last night confined to what amounts to a cell. The Irish suite, my Aunt Ludmila decorated herself. Overly fond of the collar puss, but cell seems a bit ungenerous. The collar is fine. It is the armed guards that offend my sensibility. Is this how you treat all of your guests? Talia, whispered Nikolai. I think he's calling you bad company. He leaned back and rested his elbows on the arms of his chair. Yuri, you have enemies. Those guards were there for your protection. Yuri sniffed. My followers will not stand for this, and that was why Nikolai had sent bread, smoked cod, and some very fine kvass to the people camped outside the city. Compliments of the crown. Men with full bellies complained less. In truth, Nikolai had meant to see to Yuri yesterday, but the afternoon's business had gotten the better of his time. And as for the night, well, that had certainly gotten the better of him too. Yuri, may I introduce? No, you may not. I wish to speak on the matter of the Starless One, and abruptly Yuri straightened. His eyes widened and his jaw went slack as he looked around the room and seemed to finally register where he was. He clasped his hands like a soprano about to sing. Oh, the monk gasped. Oh, it's you, it's all of you. He turned to the members of the triumvirate and bowed deeply. Moi Souverainier, it's an honor, he bowed a second time. An absolute honor. Down he went again, a dream really. Nikolai suppressed a groan. Just what had he brought upon himself? Zoya and Genya exchanged a baffled glance, and even David looked up from his work long enough to frown in confusion. Do stop that, Zoya said. You look like an oil derrick. Commander Zoya Nasyalinsky, Yuri said in a strangled breath. Yesterday, I didn't realize. I thought you were just one of the king's lackeys. Zoya ignored Yuri's protest and said, You do realize every member of this triumvirate fought against your beloved Starless Saints in the Civil War? Yes, of course. The monk pushed his wire-rimmed spectacles up the bridge of his long nose. I do, but, well, David Kostick, the great fabricator who forged the first amplifier worn by Sancta Aline herself. David looked at him blankly and returned to his reading. Zoya Nazyalensky, who was one of the Darkling's most favored soldiers. Zoya lip curled. And then, of course, Genya Safin, the first tailor who bears the marks of the Darkling's blessing. Genya flinched. Blessing? I beg your pardon? Said Zoya, already raising her hands either to summon a storm or to wring Yuri's neck. Tamar reached for her axes. Talia actually growled. Nikolai rapped his knuckles against the table. That's enough, everyone. Stand down. Yuri, you are trespassing in territory you cannot begin to understand. Despite his height, the monk looked like little more than a gawky child who had broken his mother's favorite vase. Forgive me. I meant no offense. Slowly, Genya stood, and silence fell around her. How old are you, Yuri? 18, Moi Souveraini.
When I was a year older than you, the Darkness set his monsters on me, creatures born of the power you venerate so much. They had a taste for human flesh. He had to force them to stop. That he was not so cruel, Genya held up a hand, and Nikolai was glad to see Yuri shut his mouth. The Darkling didn't want me to die. He wanted me to live like this. More fool him, said Nikolai quietly, to let such a soldier survive. Genya gave the barest nod. Think twice before you use the word blessing, monk. She sat and folded her hands. Proceed. Just a moment, David said, planting a finger on the page to mark his place in his book. What was your name? Yuri Vedenen, Moiseverny. Yuri Vedenen. If you upset my wife again, I will kill you. Oh, they got married! I will kill you where you stand. The monk swallowed. Yes, Moiseverny. Oh, David, Genya said, taking his hand. You've never threatened to murder anyone for me before, haven't I? He murmured distractedly. Lisa kissed on her knuckles and continued reading. Forgive me, I am overwhelmed, Yuri said, then rose again as if he couldn't help himself. To think I'm in rooms built by the Starless One himself. He touched his fingers to the black seams that marked the shadow fold in the map. It is too glorious to contemplate. Is this Coide? Reindeer, I believe, said Nikolai. Remarkable. Wait, said Zoya, blue eyes slitted. You said the Starless One himself, not his ancestors. Yuri turned from the map with a smug smile on his lips. Yes, I did. I know there was only one Darkling, one man of great power who faked his death many times, a precaution against small minds who might have feared his extraordinary power and his long life. And how did you arrive at his theory? Asked Nikolai. Yuri blinked. It's not a theory, I know. The Darkling revealed as much to me in a vision. Zoya's brows rose, and Nikolai had to fight the urge to roll his eyes. Instead, he tented his fingers and said, I see. But Yuri's smile just deepened. I know you think me mad, but I have seen miracles. And that was exactly why Nikolai had brought him here. You said something the other day, that the age of saints was upon us. What did you mean? How else do you account for the miracles taking place throughout Ravka? So it begins? Muttered Zoya. We've heard the stories, said Nikolai mildly, but there are rational explanations for these occurrences. We live in difficult times, and people are bound to look for miracles. To Nikolai's surprise, the young monk sat down at the table and leaned across it, his expression earnest. Your Highness, I know you are not a man of faith, but the people believe these happenings are not just phenomena in search of explanation. They believe they are the work of saints. They are the work of Grisha, said Zoya. Possibly the shoe. Possibly your dear friend the Apparat. Ah, said Yuri, but some people believe all of the old miracles were the work of Grisha. Then call it the small science and dispense with all of this superstition. Would that make it easier to accept the divine? Yuri asked, his spectacles glinting. If I call these works the making at the heart of the world, would that help? I've studied Grisha theory too. Zoya's eyes were hard as gems. I'm not here to debate theology with a mop handle. Yuri sat back, his expression beatific. The saints are returning to Ravka, and the Starless One will be among them. The Darkling is dead, Kenny said, and Nikolai did not miss the white knuckles of her clasped hands. I watched his body burn. Yuri cast a nervous glance at David and said, There are some who believe the Darkling did not die in the fold and is simply awaiting his chance to return. I was there too, monk, said Zoya. I saw him burn away to ash atop a funeral pyre fed by inferni flame. The monk closed his eyes briefly, pained. Yes, of course, that was his martyrdom, and his body was destroyed. But the darkness power is extraordinary, ancient. It may be gone, or it may still live, and in the world and his spirit with it. Zoya pressed her lips together, folding her arms tightly against her body, as if to keep away the cold. Nikolai did not like what he was hearing. A scrap of that incident power still resided within his own body, and if last night was any indication, it was growing stronger by the day. You think all of these separate incidents, these supposed miracles, are related to the Darkling? He asked. No, exclaimed the monk. He leaned even farther forward. In a moment his chin was going to make contact with the table. I know they are. He rose and gestured to the map behind them. If I may? He looked around, darting right and left, robes flapping like the wings of a deranged bird. This is what the Darkling's acolytes look like, whispered Zoya. If we'd left the body, he would be returning in his grave. Aha, Yuri said, finding the small clothed flags that could be pinned to the hides. The maps were pocked with tiny holes where former leaders had planned military campaigns. The earthquake at Revos, the statue at Tesmna, the roof of mire at Arkesk, the bleeding walls in Idova, the roses in Adena. One after another he listed the supposed miracles as he put pins on the map, then he stood back. They began here. Far along the coast and mountains and borders, but day by day, the occurrences have become more frequent, and they've drawn closer to the fold, said Nikolai. The pattern was clear. A radiant star burst with its heart-dead center in the sea. Saints, breathed Zoya. Is that where Genya began? Yes, said Nikolai. Though he didn't remember much of the final battle, he'd been infected with the monster already, fighting with it for control of his consciousness, and winning far more often than he was now. He'd been lucid in long flashes, even in his transformed state, and had sought out help from Alina. He had even tried to aid their forces in that last confrontation. The miracle sites were closing in on the same central spot, the place where the fold had once been, where the Darkling had made his last stand, where he had faced Alina Starkov and died by her hand. Victory. At least that was what it looked like at the time. A country united, possibility of peace, and Nikolai suddenly and swiftly purged of the demon that had battled him for control. He had believed the darkness within him had been vanquished at the moment of the Darkling's death. He had believed the war was over, and yet the monster had risen up to take hold of him again. Had the demon always been there, troubling his dreams, his constant companion awaiting its moment, or had something woken it? Nikolai looked at the pins splayed over the map. Was there a pattern, or was Yuri seeing what he wanted to? It was the seemingly guiltless Zila playing a deeper game. Forgive me, Yuri, Nikolai said, but your goal is to have the Darkling recognized as a saint by the Ravkan Church. You have every reason to try to tie these occurrences to the Starless One. I have no reason to lie, said Yuri. Only days ago a sight appeared at the fold, a lake of black rock, a sun in eclipse. Zoya expelled that expirated breath, or a geological anomaly. Yuri poked his bony finger at the map. This is not just where the Starless One passed from this life. It is a place of ancient power, the very place the Darkling first ruptured the world and created the fold. You can't possibly know that, Zoya said with a dismissive wave. It was the subject of my studies in Priestguard. It's all in the texts. Which texts? She asked, and Nikolai wondered if she was deliberately trying to bait the monk. The Book of Alyosha, the Sicurian Psalms. You can see it illustrated in the Histori Sanctia. A children's book? It was the holy site, insisted Yuri. The place where Sankt Felix was speared by the apple bows, an ancient place of healing and glorious power where man came to be purified. Nikolai sat up straighter. Purified? Of what exactly? Yuri opened his mouth, closed it. I misspoke. No, he didn't, said Talia. He's talking about the Abysbaya. Aren't you, monk? I hate to admit my ignorance, said Nikolai. It's so much more fun for people to discover it on their own. But what exactly is the Abysbumpy? No idea, said Goya. Genya shrugged, and even Davy shook his head. To Nicola's surprise, it was Tamar who spoke. The Abysbaya, she said. The ritual of the burning thorn. Do you know how the Priestguard were first created? Those are children's stories, said Zoya scornfully. Possibly, Talia conceded. Tell me a story then, said Nikolai. Tamar folded her arms. Why don't you do the honors, monk? Yuri hesitated, then said, It begins with the first lance of King Yaromir the Determined. He shut his eyes, his voice taking on a more confident, even cadence. Before him, the territory that would become Ravka was little more than a collection of warring provinces led by squabbling kings. He subdued them and brought them together beneath his double eagle banner. But the invasions from Pierda to the north and Shuhan to the south were relentless and put the young kingdom in a constant state of war. Sounds familiar? Nikolai knew the story from his own childhood classrooms. He always found it disheartening that Ravka had been at war since its birth. There was no second army then, Yuri continued. Ravka's soldiers fought and died just as the other men did, but as the legend goes, Yaromir built an altar atop a hill in Osalta, the site of the first royal chapel, said Talia. Yuri nodded. The young king prayed to all of the saints who would hear him, and the next day, a group of monks arrived at his door and offered to fight by his side. They were not ordinary monks. When they went into battle, they could take on the shapes of beasts. They fought not as men, but as all manner of creature, wolf, dragon, hawk, bear. The king had heard stories of these monks, but hardly believed they were true until he saw these miracles for himself. Always with the miracles, grumbled Zoya. Yes, said Yuri, opening his eyes, fervor burning in them like a brand. Always. The monks agreed to fight for the king. They asked for neither gold nor land, but only that one of them would always remain at the king's side, so that Ravka would forever be devoted to the worship of the saints. The monks plunged into battle and sent the enemies of Ravka scattering, pushing them back and forming the borders that would hold more or less for thousands of years. Yuri's voice rose, caught in the telling of his tale, and all hesitation gone. But the battle lasted so long that when it was over, and it was time for them to return to their human forms, they could not. Their leader brought them to the side of an ancient thornwood, and there they endured a dangerous ritual, the Obisbaya. Those who survived became men once more, and their leader took his place beside Yaromir. Eventually, the priest who held the office closest to the king was given the title of Aparat, and the holy soldiers that surrounded him became the priest guard. Some people claim the first priest guard were Grisha, said Tolia. Tamar touched her fingers to the shark's tooth at her neck. In that version, the animals they became were the first amplifiers. Their spirits made the monk's power stronger. Nikolai studied Yuri. The story was strange, no doubt, and likely more fiction than fact. Even so, a ritual to purge beast from man. What exactly did it entail? Yuri pushed his spectacles up his nose, the confident scholar vanishing with a single gesture. I'm not sure. There are conflicting texts. You're not really a firebrand, are you, Yuri? A smile touched the monk's lips. I suppose not. And yet you ended up at my gates, calling me a traitor and thief. Yuri at least had the manners to squirm. What brought you there? The saints, I believe that. Nikolai had his doubts. Tell me about this ritual. Why? Yuri asked perfunctorily. I am a king. I long for entertainment. The monk tugged on his crackly beard. I don't know details. There are conflicting accounts in the text, and I'm no longer permitted. They're religious texts, aren't they? Nikolai said. From the priest guard's library. You don't have access anymore. No. The ache in his voice was palpable. Nikolai thought he understood. There had been a time when words had been the only place he could find solace. No book ever lost patience with him or told him to sit still. When his tutors had thrown up their hands in frustration, it was the library that had taught Nikolai military history, strategy, chemistry, astronomy. Each spine had been an open doorway whispering, come in, come in. Here is a land you've never seen before. Here is a place to hide when you're frightened, to play when you're bored, to rest when the world seemed unkind. Yuri knew that solace. He had once been a scholar. Perhaps he'd like to be one again. Nikolai stood. Thank you, Yuri. You've been most helpful. The monk rose slowly. I have? Then will you lend your name to our plea, Your Highness? The apparat cannot ignore the voice of the king. If you would petition him to, I will think on it, Yuri. You've made an interesting argument. For now, I will have you escorted back to your rooms. Then, I am a prisoner still? You are a welcome guest whom I don't want to stray too far, and perhaps I can get you access to some reading materials. Yuri paused as if uncertain he'd heard correctly. My books? Perhaps. That would be... No, I must return to my fellow worshippers outside of the city. You cannot keep, and you will. But we must ask that you enjoy our hospitality a short while longer, while we consider the merits of your case. Yuri's chin lifted. For the Starless One, I can wait an eternity. But do not play games with me, Your Highness. I did not come to the capital to be laughed at or to dilly-dally about. Dally, yes. Dilly, no, said Nikolai. Gave it up in my youth. Zoya rolled her eyes, and Tolia shuffled Yuri out the door into the care of two palace guards. When Yuri was gone, Nikolai rose to look more closely at the pins on the map. In the wake of the monk's departure, the silence in the room felt heavy, as if another presence had entered the chamber, something old and nameless. The boy is mad, said Zoya. He's a believer, said Dahlia. Those aren't the same thing. And I'd rather a true believer than a man like the apparat, Genya added. How can you say that, said Zoya. He worships a tyrant, a murderer, the man who tortured you. Genya sighed. Can we blame him for being drawn to Darkling's strength? We all were. We didn't know what he was then, didn't we? Genya adjusted her eye patch. Yuri is a frightened boy looking for something bigger than himself to give his life meaning. There are people like him all over Ravka. That's what worries me. Tolia sat down beside his sister, and Nikolai caught the look that passed between them. This was not the time to start keeping secrets. What is it? Tolia heaved his great shoulders. There may be something to Yuri's story. The priest guard weren't always just lackeys for the apparat. They were holy warriors who served the crown as well. When I was younger, I wanted nothing more than to join them. What stopped you? Nikolai asked. He wasn't surprised exactly. Both Tolia and Tamar had been raised in the church, and he was well aware that if Alina Starkov hadn't given Nikolai her blessing as king, the twins would never have pledged themselves as his guards. They wouldn't let me join, said Tamar. No women allowed. Talia nodded. I had to question a holy order that claimed to want warriors but would deny a fighter like Tamar. Tamar rested her hands on her axes. The saints had a different plan for us. Ah, said Nikolai. But what do the saints have planned now? Zoya, when I got free from Duke Radimov's estate in Ivets, you found me where? At Goose Farm on the road to Varna. Nikolai touched his finger to the map, a northeastern path, but every time I've gotten loose from the palace, I've headed northwest. Each time I've taken the same route, just gone a little farther. What if the creature is trying to get to that spot on that fold? What if it wants to be free of me as much as I want to be free of it? Or what if those supposed miracles are a plan to lure you from the palace, said Zoya. To the fold? Why? Zoya cast up her hands. I don't know. The miracles began when the demon woke inside me. It may be connected to the Darkling's power, or Yuri may be talking nonsense, but that pattern is real. Something is happening, and it's connected to the spot on the shadow fold. It's not safe to leave the palace, Zoya protested. There are no safe places. Not anymore. He had proven that himself last night. Genya will mix me a stronger tonic. David will forge thicker chains. I'm going on a pilgrimage. To some mystical thornwood, said Zoya. Even if it once existed, the fold obliterated everything in its path. There's nothing there anymore. Zoya spoke a long string of words, only a few of which Nikolai could pick out. Then he said, Lost faith is the roots of a forgotten wood, waiting to thrive once more. Zoya narrowed her eyes. We agreed no poetry during meetings. It's liturgical Ravkan, Tolia objected. It's from the book of Alyosha, which you might know if you ever went to church. It's a wonder I've survived this long without such knowledge. Tolia, Nikolai interrupted. I'm going to need you to find any text you can on the Obisbaya and anything connected to it. I don't want you to be the only scholar I can rely on. I'm not a scholar, protested Tolia. You might have been in another life, said Nikolai. What do you mean, the only scholar? Zoya said. You can't possibly mean to travel with the monk. Kenya shifted in her seat. It will look like you're lending support to the cult of the Starless. I don't like the message that sends. We'll make sure Yuri is disguised, and I don't intend to take a direct route to the fold, said Nikolai. There may be something we can learn at the other miracle sites, and visiting them will give me an opportunity to walk among my subjects before I choose a bride. We have armies massing at both borders. New lands of pretenders cropping up to make claims on the throne. Our coffers are empty and our allies are few. I cannot afford to lose the support of the common people. We're going to need it in the days to come. And what if it all leads to nothing? Asked Genya. What if the Darkling left you with his curse and there are no answers to be found? Zoya laid her fingers flat on the table. What if Yuri discovers the truth about the monster? Then we pray I can silence him and keep this secret long enough to secure Ravka's future. Even without an heir, there may be a way to keep the throne safe and make sure the country isn't left vulnerable. And what exactly is that? Asked Zoya. Are you sure you don't want to try trusting me, Zoya? It's positively intoxicating. The idea had come to him the previous week when they arrived from the court from Count Kirigin's and had been greeted by Trukin and Isaac. Zoya pursed her lips. I don't like any of this. There's too much room for disaster. Nikolai knew that. They were running out of time, and his journey to the fold smacked of desperation. He could not deny the fear that clung to him, the doubt it sowed in his heart. What if his mind unraveled and his will with it? What if he attacked one of his friends again and there was no one there to stop him? What damage might he unleash on the people he loved? On the world? Nikolai could not deny those fears, but he refused to give in to them. He would not just hand the monster a victory. He turned to the people assembled before him, his advisors, his soldiers, his family. He needed them to believe, if not in Yuri's tales, then in Nikolai himself. The person he had been before the Darkling and the war. He straightened the lapels of his velvet coat and winked. It's not exciting if nothing can go wrong. He felt the monster recoil, action, decision. In moments like these, he felt almost like his old self. If this thing wanted to claim his soul, Nikolai intended to give it a dang good fight. And that battle began here now, with the refusal to relinquish any bit of his spirit to the terror trying to drag him into the dark. He would do what he had always done. He would charge forward and pray that hope might be waiting like the roots of the thornwood, just out of sight. Oh, that's pretty much it.